Hi, Brooke. Um, we met a couple of years ago when I interviewed you for the New York Sun about your film, The Making of a Martyr. Um, at that time, well, a few years prior, in 2004, you and your co-producer, Alistair Leyland, had traveled to the West Bank, interviewed families of child suicide bombers, friends of these children, those terrorists who recruited these children, and in the case of Hussam Abdu, the 15-year-old who had a change of heart at an Israeli checkpoint, you actually interviewed the would-be suicide bomber himself. Why risk your life to have done this, and what did you learn?
Well, the reason why I became involved in the subject matter in the first place is I was in second year of law school. It was back in 2004. And I happened to be taking a class called Human Rights in the Child. And I was watching television, and there was a scene of a 15-year-old, physically handicapped, rumored to be mentally handicapped, child suicide bomber named Hussam Abdu, who subsequently became the main character of my film, The Making of a Martyr, and he was caught at an Israeli border checkpoint with bombs around his waist. Less than 48 hours before he had been recruited by the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades and told that when he blew himself up, he would go to heaven. Now, I found the story quite compelling because this child proved smarter than the adults who recruited him in the first place because he voluntarily gave himself in. He turned himself into the IDF, and then he was subsequently charged and convicted of attempted murder. And I visited him while he was serving out his prison sentence. Now, as a student of the law at that time, it occurred to me that this child was a victim. He was a victim of one of the most egregious forms of child abuse that is occurring today, which is the intentional, premeditated incitement and recruitment of innocent Muslim children to become suicide bombers, child soldiers, and human shields. And Hussam Abdu, this 50-year-old child, was not the correct person to be prosecuted. Instead, we should have been going after the satellite companies, for example, that are broadcasting Al-Manar Network, which is Hezbollah TV, which broadcasts cartoons and television programs aimed at children, teaching them to blow themselves up. So he was definitely the wrong target. So I ended up writing my thesis on this, and the thesis basically stated that teaching a child from infancy to aspire to kill himself as a suicide bomber, as a child soldier, is a form of child abuse. It's a form of state-sponsored mass infanticide. And frankly, it's a form of societal suicide that is being widely ignored by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, by all the other groups that pay so much attention, like Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, about the abuse of children in Africa, for example. They're turning a blind eye to the abuse of Muslim children at the hands of their own government. So I felt compelled to write my thesis on this, and then I traveled to the West Bank with the co-producer of my film, Alistair Leyland, and the goal was to collect evidence from the mouths of the perpetrators and the victims themselves. And subsequently, we made a documentary film about it, called The Making of a Martyr. We screened it in film festivals throughout the globe. We were awarded a prize by the United Nations, which I find ironic because they're one of the parties through their schools, UNRWA, that I would accuse of aiding and abetting the intentional murder of innocent Palestinian children because they use Hamas textbooks. And the goal was to raise awareness about this issue.
Yes. Well, you mentioned that when you went to gather evidence. So you already had a sense that this was an abuse of children. Were there any things that you, again, I think what really distinguishes the work you've done is that you risked your life to go firsthand, to actually speak to the families of these children, their friends, these recruiters, terrorists who exploit them. So, I think that your information is a primary source information. You have a lot of first-hand knowledge about this phenomenon. And what was it that was there anything that you learned or that surprised you? Did you go with sort of an open mind to the idea that, well, who knows why these kids are doing this? Some people believe it's desperation about the political situation.
Yeah, well, the idea, like I said, was to raise awareness about the abuse of Muslim children in this form, something that was, being ignored by human rights groups, and also to change, the public perception of why we have suicide bombers in the first place,
Right,
why we have
right.
child suicide bombers. A lot of people, when they watch the news, they hear of a suicide attack, and the news media doesn't explain how old was the bomber. Where did the bomber come from? Had they been drugged? Were they kidnapped? Was it a woman who was subsequently threatened with an honor killing? Is that why she blew herself up?
Right.
So whenever we hear that a suicide bombing occurred, in Israel or in Iraq or in Afghanistan, the American public tends to ask themselves, why do they hate us? What are we doing that's so wrong that could drive someone to blow himself up and kill innocents?
Right.
And with my film, I hope people understand this is the wrong question to be asking. The correct question is, why are they teaching their children from infancy to aspire to kill Jews, to kill Americans, and to aspire to kill themselves for this form of martyrdom? Why is Islam being manipulated in a way to justify the murder of innocent Muslim children? These are the correct questions that we should be asking ourselves.
So you didn't feel that these individuals whose families you spoke with, whose friends, one of them was Hussam Abdu, one was Wafa Idris, who I believe was the first female suicide bomber to target Israelis. You didn't feel that they were motivated by political reasons, the West Bank, the checkpoints.
Of all
Why
the
did they do
children
it?
that I spoke to, and we interviewed dozens of children in the West Bank, in Islamic Jihad Academy, in Jenin, Ramallah, Tulkam, Nablus. We went to the schools, we read their textbooks, we interviewed their parents, we went to the jails. Of all the children that we spoke to, not one told me that they wanted to blow themselves up for political reasons. Not one told me that it was because of American or Israeli foreign policy, or because of the failed Camp David Accords, or because Sharon walked on the Temple Mount, therefore I'm going to blow myself up for strategic reasons.
Any of that?
These are impressionable kids. They were not doing it out of desperation. They're doing it out of aspiration. Aspiration to become famous. Aspiration to be cool. Aspiration to have your face on Martyr posters. When I was there, the latest trend was a sticker album. Children were being distributed sticker albums where you had bodies placed in heaven, and you would collect the severed heads of past suicide bombers and place them on the correct bodies. For them, they're the heroes for kids here are Superman or Batman or the Jonas Brothers or what have you. For a child in the West Bank, the hero is the suicide bomber who managed to kill the most amount of Jews, of Israeli civilians. So this is clearly a form of brainwashing and manipulation. And I would even go as far as making the legal argument that the child suicide bomber is an innocent party. He or she is as much a victim of a crime as are the innocent civilians killed in the attack, because they are a product of a very shrewd brainwashing and recruitment strategy that literally targets them from infancy through their school textbooks, radio programs, television programs, their religious clerics. And this isn't just a problem happening, my film is a product of what I had access to with a camera in a car over a period of a year and a half. And it's based in the West Bank. But the incitement towards violence that is being directed to innocent Muslim children is a problem not just in the Muslim countries, but also in the West. We have a serious problem here as well of radicalization of Muslim youth. Just a couple years ago, MI5, the UK, FBI version of the FBI, seized DVDs being marketed and sold to British-born Muslim youth, teaching them how to become suicide bombers. We have a problem of radicalization in mosques in the UK, for example, and in France. In Pakistan, we're seeing 6, 7, 8-year-old children that are being kidnapped by the Taliban, and they're being blown up. Now the whole practice is mutating. They're now blowing them up by remote control.
Unbelievable. And just hearing that is, I think we all know that children are very impressionable, and to know kids in any part of the world, it's just human beings in general are impressionable and subject to influence by brainwashing. But a child who grows up indoctrinated and from multiple sources receiving that kind of a message, it's just It's horrific, and it is it's hard to imagine, but I think it's what you're talking about speaks to, again, based on your firsthand research and investigation, it suggests that there's a lot of misperception about what, I wonder if you can extrapolate from your expertise is in child suicide bombing, but do you think that what you learned has bearing on the phenomenon more broadly? A lot of people believe that suicide bombing is an expression of desperation about, land disputes. These people are just. But one of the things that you discovered, if I'm correct, is that a lot of the children anyway, and I believe it was the case with Wafa Idris, they were targeted very cynically by the so-called leadership because they were outsiders in some way. They were not well adjusted. They were depressed for their own reasons, their personal reasons, and they were targeted and systematically indoctrinated and used as tools by a corrupt leadership, as opposed to being, people who were revolutionaries, filled with some kind of a zeal to, it's actually much more calculated and evil practice than people realize.
There's no justification whatsoever to murder an innocent child, especially your own child. There's no justification politically. There's no moral justification. There's no religious justification. There's no ethical justification. And those who call child suicide bombers freedom fighters, we should take a very close look at what the motives of those people are. Are they condoning the murder of innocent Muslim children as suicide bombers? Is that what they're really doing? I find that this is a subject that you are able to find base consensus with people that you would otherwise disagree on.
Well, that's
even the adults, who somehow justify suicide bombing as a legitimate tactic of a, lesser armed group against a state, for example, even they usually have problems with the recruitment of an innocent 6-year-old child in this fashion. I'll give you an example. When Karzai came to the United States and he was invited by Bush, he made the point of publicly pardoning a 6-year-old who was recruited by the Taliban and told his belt would explode flowers. Now, even the 6-year-old knew something was up. He, too, turned himself in, which is now why they're using remote-controlled detonators to prevent children from turning themselves in. But when Karzai pardoned him, what happened? The Afghani elders condemned the Taliban. So these are adults who would otherwise support suicide bombing as a tactic, now condemned the Taliban for the use of children, because even they were able to make a distinction between the two.
It was so evil that they couldn't, it woke them up to.
And the Taliban, because they understand that this is also a hearts and minds battle, publicly denied recruiting the child, because they knew that they would lose supporters within the Muslim world. So I do believe that if we raise awareness about this subject within the Muslim and non-Muslim world, and we have enough people speak out against this tactic, perhaps it will stop. In the meantime, however, for example, what's happening in the Swat Valley, you have the Taliban going from home to home, kidnapping a son, forcing him into madrasas where they educate and teach these children how to become child soldiers and how to become suicide bombers. And I don't hear Coalition to Stop Abuse of Child Soldiers publicly condemning this. When's the last time Human Rights Watch came out with a report saying child suicide bombing is a crime against humanity? Are the lives of these children worth less to these organizations when they're killed in this manner?
This is happening, in other words, this is happening in Afghanistan now.
It's happening in Afghanistan, Iraq, in Algeria. You have, like I said, the problem of the incitement.
Child suicide bombing.
Exactly. You have the problem of incitement towards violence directed at children, even occurring in the Iranian curriculum, in the Saudi Arabian curriculum. And what we see now is more and more children are being abused and used in this fashion. Why? What does that tell us about suicide bombing as a tactic? Well, it could say that less and less adults are willing to sacrifice their lives, that more and more adults are realizing the futility of this act, which is why they're now turning to handicapped children, pregnant women. They're drugging the children, blowing them up by remote control. And so you just have to think, when we hear about a suicide attack here, we're watching CNN or MSNBC, and we're not being told how old the suicide bomber was or where they come from. We have to think very carefully what that suicide attack means to us. You keep mentioning, Wafa Idris, and I keep forgetting to tell the story.
It's an interesting
It was
one,
fascinating. I interviewed her mother as well as her nieces, and it's in my film. Here was a woman. She was the first female Palestinian suicide bomber. She ended up blowing herself up. I believe it was in a pizza parlor, killing one person, wounding 100. She was hailed as a hero throughout the Muslim
Still
world.
is,
Yeah.
I think.
And there are, schools erected in her name. I interviewed her nieces who told me they want to be just like Wafa. They want to blow themselves up.
I remember. Yeah.
And the story, which was not widely circulated, is that she was divorced, she was barren, she was an adulteress, she was threatened with an honor killing. So she was faced with the choice of either being, stoned publicly in the streets of the West Bank and leaving your family in shame, or blowing yourself up. Your mother's going to receive a pension from the Arab bank or whatever bank that so happens to be paying, the rewards of suicide bombers, and they'll be able to hold their heads high. When I interviewed their nieces, they said, now we can hold our heads high because Wafa was a hero. Right. Otherwise, they had been shamed by this barren adulteress's activities. So her motives, it's, pretty clear, weren't political.
No,
her motives were to save the reputation of her family.
Sounds like she was very much recruited and used. She was identified as a sort of someone who was vulnerable by these totally corrupt individuals.
Absolutely.
She's a
they
human
go
gauntlet.
for the most marginalized kids, whose son was physically a dwarf. When there's no such thing as political correctness in the West Bank or Gaza. So if there's something physically wrong with you, people assume there's something also mentally wrong with you. He was a marginalized child. He had no friends. He was paid $100 to blow himself
This
up.
is Hussam Abdu,
Exactly.
the subject.
They go off the most marginalized
the making of a
characters.
murder.
Absolutely.
Yes,
and it's clearly a form of manipulation.
And again, I this is my speculation, but I wonder how much of that dynamic exists with, as far as regular suicide bombing. I mean, people, again,
Regular suicide bombing?
Well, adult
Such thing
suicide.
regular?
No, there is no such thing. But I mean, adult suicide bombing. Again, I question whether this idea that it's born of some kind of revolutionary desperation is a misunderstanding of what's happening. It seems like, in fact, there are a lot of very corrupt individuals who use weaker people as a tool in order to create a propaganda war, to fight a propaganda war. And I think a lot of people in the West buy into that. They very uncritically digest this idea that it's all it's political, therefore it can be appeased, it can be addressed by political concessions, when in fact the underlying dynamic may be something far more sinister.
Well, look, my specialty and what I've studied and, what I've focused on for the past 4 years and what my organization focuses on is the child suicide bombing phenomenon. So what I can say about adults, though, is, the reason why you have a 26-year-old or a 27-year-old who's willing to commit mass murder against innocent civilians, not just willing, but celebrates it. And the reason why you have an adult who believes so strongly in the fact that he will be rewarded in a paradise is most likely because of the education that he received and the values that were imparted upon him during his childhood.
You have to wonder,
and what you see now is, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Muslim children are being currently educated in madrasas throughout the Muslim and non-Muslim world and taught hate and taught violence, and their rights are clearly being abused. They're being subject to this form of child abuse. What then is the future going to look like? How many adults are we going to see in 20, 25 years when these children are 30, 35 years old who are willing to kill, innocent civilians in the same fashion? Most likely, if you look at the statistics, adult suicide bombing is going to be a greater problem in the future than it is now. And I think that's exactly the tactic. The people who are running the schools know very well what they are doing. They are breeding a generation full of hate,
Yeah.
and they are committing, like I said, a form of state-sponsored mass infanticide, if not societal suicide. You have something that is going on that is completely historically unprecedented. A state advocating the mass murder of their own children in this fashion. Because remember, the suicide bomber is the suicide homicide bomber. Yes, they're killing machines, but the primary goal is to martyr yourself. When I spoke to these children, none of them actually comprehended that when you blow your limbs up, you die. They didn't comprehend death. They would describe to me very clearly what heaven would look like, what their house would look like, how many candies they would have, what kinds of candies, who they would bring with them, what family members they would have.
Yeah.
So they literally don't comprehend death.
Yes.
And
it's a developmental thing. I don't think people, until they're a certain age, really can comprehend death. I mean, I think
children are easily manipulated.
Yeah.
They're extremely impressionable characters, which is why teaching a child from infancy that he should revere martyrdom is one of the greatest crimes possible, because not only do you ruin that child, God forbid that child should ever choose or be recruited to blow himself up, but you subsequently damage that person, where later in adulthood they will still be suffering psychological issues.
Yes. Well, it's staggering to even consider the scope of this, and I absolutely congratulate you on going to the front lines and investigating it firsthand, conducting your interviews and your primary source research so that we can really have a better understanding of it. I also wanted to talk with you about...
Let me just give a little plug, though. Of course. So if anybody is interested in watching the movie or learning more about the subject, you can go to childrensrightsinstitute.org, childrensrightsinstitute.org, and the movie is The Making of a Martyr, and I encourage everyone to watch it and comment on it, and I read the comments frequently, and hopefully we can spark some sort of public debate and dialogue about the issue, because so far the silence that this issue is being met with is just horrible, and is sending the green light to these parties that they could basically continue with these tactics with impunity.